VRC-Pro, The Inside Story. Episode 15, The Uncanny Valley Theory and VRC-Pro. My name is Peter Barefoots. Back to the trusted VRC office again, and ready for the second half of the Inside Story, a step-by-step insight into how VRC evolved from nothing till what it is today, VRC-Pro. And no relevant objects on my desk, as this episode is about a theory. At the end of the previous episode, I asked if you had any idea of what the uncanny valley theory is about. In this episode, I will explain why it was so relevant for the V4 development process and the success of VRC-Pro. Back in 2007, my son Tim introduced me to a concept that is critical for anyone building a simulator. It is called the uncanny valley. He was studying data science and writing a thesis on human-robot interaction. For his project, a study for Philips Medical, he used a quirky cat-like robot called the iCat to play card games with people. Tim found that everyone loved this stylized little cat. Why? Because nobody expected it to look or act like a real person. It was just a pleasant, functional machine. But here is the trap we face when building an RC simulator. Adding realism improves the user experience, but only up to a certain point. The moment you try to make the virtual experience look and feel exactly like the real thing, the slightest flaws start to look incredibly uncanny. A glitchy animation or a slightly off-feeling car doesn't just break the immersion. It creates instant cognitive dissonance and resistance. People feel uncomfortable and the simulation falls flat. That creepy feeling only goes away when your realism hits a flawless 99.9% or when you use clever design nudges to avoid the gap. Back in 2007, that level of realism seemed impossible for us to reach. Today, graphics and physics have changed the game, but the rule remains. If you go for absolute realism in your simulator, you better get it exactly right. The uncanny valley effect was first studied and published back in 1970 by Masahiro Mori, a Japanese robotics scientist. This was in the very early days of computer behavioral science, and apparently Mori was foreseeing robots already back then. Mori based his theory on earlier studies by Sigmund Freud about the psychology of the uncanny or the creepy. He found a direct relationship between familiarity or acceptance and human likeness. This was a gradual ascending relationship until around 75% human likeness and then a sudden drop. This drop was reversed at around 80%. And then a sharp rise to full familiarity at 100% human likeness. This drop and rise in the graph can be seen as a valley. That's why he called it the uncanny valley. See the diagram. So what does this have to do with racing sims in general, and VRC in particular? I touched on this subject in episode 5 when I explained about creating the right feel. In many ways, also simulation games are subject to this uncanny valley effect. The familiarity or acceptance perception also has a similar relationship with realism and in many cases feel. Very simple racing games like Mario Kart were so popular because they didn't pretend to have any realism at all. Mario Kart was developed to be positioned well before the sharp uncanny valley drop-off and was and still is hugely successful even in this age of ultra-realistic games. For many games, though, it was mainly about the graphics and how well characters and sceneries could be animated. Graphics quality evolved with technology, i.e. graphics cards, and animation quality evolved with software development, i.e. graphics engines, and since a few years especially AI. For a racing sim like VRC, we are looking at 4 different areas where the uncanny valley effect applies. Graphics, sound, handling, and control. Each has its own uncanny valley curve and has a different weight in the total experience, the total uncanny valley curve. Our aim has always been to create the most realistic RC racing sim possible, with a realism of 95% or higher, although this is hard to measure, of course. First, about the uncanny valley aspects of the VRC graphics. You either keep it simple or go all the way and avoid dropping into the valley. Our aim for V4 was to jump over the valley by creating a state-of-the-art graphics engine that would produce jaw-dropping graphics quality at a very high frame rate. Of course, easier said than done when starting from scratch. and with hardly any experience. I will write more about the development of our own graphics engine in a later episode. It took us 6 years, and I'll explain why our own graphics engine eventually became one of the limiting factors for the further development of VRC-Pro. I already knew that Tony could deliver the highest possible track and car graphics. It was more a question if our graphics engine would be able to turn Tony's graphics artwork into an ultra-realistic experience on your computer screen, and of course at the highest possible frame rate. At a much later stage in the VRC project, off-road cars and tracks were added to my wish list for V4, a good example of feature creep. This meant entering unknown territory. Thus far, we had only done on-road cars and tracks. Developing off-road cars and tracks was going to be a whole new challenge, and we had to make sure not to fall in the uncanny valley trap. Off-road is completely different from on-road. It would require new physics to handle rough terrain and the car in flight, and of course also special visual effects needed for off-road, like animated suspension, dust, undulated tracks, etc. For sure, we would have to be at 90 to 95% on the realism axis of the uncanny valley curve for V4 to be a success. Could Todd and Tony deliver? Could Miro deliver a state-of-the-art graphics engine? A lot of uncertainties at the start of V4. Now, let's take a look at all the different elements we had to tackle. Feel is the result of a combination of all 4 uncanny valley factors: physics, controller, graphics, and sound. How realistic can the car behave? How fast and precise can you control it, i.e., respond to changes you see on your screen? And how fast can the graphics engine render the next frame in the highest possible graphics quality? The weakest link determines how you experience feel. The uncanny valley effect is immensely important. For a low-end game, you can get away with low realism. In most cases, you don't even know whatever you are controlling and what it should feel like. But if the graphics are such that you expect the handling to be of the same very high level, it becomes critical, especially for users who are very experienced with RC cars. They simply expect the car to handle exactly the same as their own RC car, even though they very well know that driving someone else's car can feel totally different because of a different setup. What we have learned in the past years is that the upward uncanny valley curve is extremely steep for experienced RC racers. This probably explains why there aren't all that many top-level RC racers in VRC, although we have seen top racers like Ronald Volker, David Rodefalk, Martin Walanka, Tom Rinderknecht actively involved in VRC for quite a long time, despite their promotional and racing commitments. Anyway, we fully understood that for V4 we had to up our efforts to reach a very high combined handling realism, physics and graphics. And with off-road to be added, the bar was even higher. Now on to the sound, the third uncanny valley factor. You expect the car to sound like what you are used to, whether it is a nitro-powered car or electric. I already knew from V3 development that sound is a very complex issue, especially recording sound samples. The way Todd's sound engine works requires sound samples of 1 to 2 second length, recorded at a steady RPM and with no fluctuation. His sound engine then interpolates the sample with engine or motor RPM. But for a nitro engine under load, the intake sound is quite different from an engine off throttle. The same applies for electric motors. They sound very different on and off load. This would require recording studio-level quality. Can you imagine this for RC cars? I have to admit that we never got to that level. We settled for trackside recording, which certainly had its limitations. At the outset of V4, I already had my doubts if we would be able to raise the sound quality we had achieved in V3. I felt what we had achieved for V3 was acceptable, probably somewhere 85 to 90% on the realism axis of the uncanny valley diagram. Status critical, I would say. It was up to Todd to make the best of the sound samples we had recorded ourselves trackside. The last uncanny valley factor about how you control your car was the least concerning. We had a long experience with our USB adapters and knew that we already were on a very good level, and that it would only get better with further hardware development of RC equipment and of USB adapter technology. But we had to make sure that the in-game calibration process was intuitive and that the game would provide for all the adjustments a racer would like to make to optimize the feel of his transmitter. Nowadays, every modern 2.4 GHz RC transmitter has all these options built in, but we had to develop them ourselves for version 4. Based on beta tester feedback, Todd added latency of a few milliseconds to the physics engine to reflect reality and bring the control factor to an even higher level. Now add to all this the correlation aspects of a virtual RC racing sim. How close can you get the virtual experience to the real experience to avoid the uncanny valley effects while playing the sim? Call it a reality check. Well, here you have it. The challenges we faced with V4 were serious and mostly unknown territory for us. Only time would tell if we would be able to develop V4 to at least 95% on the realism axis of the uncanny valley diagram. In other words, how good would all these factors correlate? Let's take a closer look at correlation between the virtual and the real experience. That's next. Make sure to subscribe to the Inside Story playlist so you don't miss an episode of this compelling story. Thank you for watching.